So, for those of you who just joined, I'm going to get started now. We have a lot to cover. I'm really, out of all of the presentations I've given in the last year, this is the one I'm most excited about. So, as I mentioned, you're here for Reimagine Your Career, Design a Future AI Can't Replace. I am Christine Perfetti, and I'm the founder of a company called Lift Up Connections. You're going to be hearing a little bit about my story and my career reinvention, as well as others I've worked with. But the goal for today, it's about you. So I mentioned this is design a future AI can't replace. We're not going to be talking about ChatGPT today or Claude or any of the other tools available to you. I have other sessions on that, but that's not the goal today. The goal today is for you to be focusing on you. It's a messy time. The majority of you who have signed up for this session are working in tech. Many of you are in design roles or product management and engineering roles. And what can I say? It's a mess out there right now. We're adapting to a lot of change. We're adapting to AI coming on the scene. There's a lot of layoffs. So, what I want to talk about today, this is not Toxic Positivity Day. So, it is a mess, but I'm going to share a little bit when we're in this messy time that it's also an opportunity for all of you. So, let's get started. Let's jump in. The way this is going to work, I'll be chatting for about 10, 15 minutes. And then I mentioned this is all about you. We're going to be going through some sprint exercises to help you start thinking about reimagining your career. So I've been running sessions primarily with women in tech around mapping out their long-term vision for their career. I really wanted to focus on this day and age and what's been happening. I saw a recent quote in interview with Bill Gates where he was talking about the future, not 10 years out future, but what will the next couple of years be? And he was saying, with AI, the need for us and humans won't really be necessary for most things. I don't know about you, but I still appreciate our humanity. And while I agree with Bill Gates that AI is an excellent partner and it will be taking over most things, for our careers, there's still a big opportunity that there's some things about us intrinsically that can't be automated, that can't be replaced. So, my goal for today, I've been running long term cohorts with folks who are trying to reimagine their career, and I bring in small groups to do that. And it's 6 weeks. I thought about how can I scale that up? So, for those of you who are on the line for 45 minutes, you can start moving forward and using some of the techniques we have. So, my goal and what success is by the end of this session, and I hope I achieve this, that you'll have a clear idea of at least one action that you can take today that will start bringing you to your next act. I'm assuming most of you are here because things aren't perfect. I have talking to some people in tech right now where they're still flying high, where their roles are great, they're on track. I know a bunch of people who are working at FANG companies where they're still doing just fine. But the majority of people I'm talking to are feeling stuck or they're burned out. What I'll say back to them is, okay, you might feel stuck, but this is actually an inflection point for you. And it's this moment where if you're feeling stuck or scared or not sure what's right for your next move, this is the moment where you can start figuring out what's next. There's different versions of feeling stuck. There's some people who are feeling really, really down, and I'll share a little bit about some of the stories. There's a lot of layoffs. There's some people who are looking for work for every role. There's typically hundreds of applications. That's feeling really, really low. But however, some of you may still have roles. But when I say you feel burned out or stuck, what I'm hearing from others is that they're still employed. They still feel safe for now. But day after day, when they're going into work, something is telling them this just isn't it. So, stuck may mean different things to all of you, but what I want to share with all of you, this is something I felt, it's an inflection point. It doesn't mean you're going to be stuck forever. It's really easy to talk in concept about shifting your careers. I wanted to just briefly share a couple of stories, three stories of real people who have pivoted recently. So you'll hear a lot of stories. I can't tell you how much I appreciate stories about pivots and people who get to the other side. But the stories I typically hear are from the gurus who have reached the other side. An example I have, I'm a big fan of Mel Robbins. She has the #1 podcast in the world. She shares a lot about her dark times and how she's gotten to the other side. But I'm not Mel Robbins. Most of the people I know aren't Mel Robbins. We're not looking to have the #1 podcast in the world. We're everyday people trying to figure out what's next and how to pivot. So I wanted to share some of those stories of successes just briefly. So Melissa Pell was working at Wayfair about 2, 3 years back. She was a product leader. She's a product executive. And her tipping point was she got laid off. And what did she do next? This was 2 years ago. She had been saying that she already recognized in her role that she wasn't feeling fulfilled, but it was okay. She was still working on some interesting projects. But when she got laid off, she took a pause. She took a break. It's now 2 years later for Melissa Pell. After her break, some of you from the product world may know who she is. She's gone from being laid off from Wayfair to co-authoring a book with Bruce McCarthy called Align: Stakeholder Management for Product Leaders. She's traveling the country and outside of the country teaching on product. And now she's a highly successful product coach, also working as a fractional product leader. I bring her story up because when we're going to go through exercises on reimagining your career, one thing people say to me all the time, well, Christine, I'm not looking to throw out my career and reimagine something different. When we talk about reinvention or reimagination, it's not throwing everything out in many cases. It's taking what you've done today and making some tweaks and incremental changes to it. So that was the case for Melissa Pell. You'll see Stephanie Gerber Wilson here. I met Stephanie now about 3 years back, and she was working in web design. She's from Massachusetts. She has a PhD. She's Dr. Wilson, and she moved into web design a few years back. She was making a lot of websites using Wix, and she would describe herself very much as a pixel pusher. Stephanie now, 3 years later, hosts her own podcast, Freedom Over Fascism. She just recently was in DC talking with one of the co-hosts of Pod Saves America on a panel. She has thousands of followers and she's publishing her podcast weekly. So she's made it to the other side. She had a huge, huge pivot. And finally, I wanted to share Rob Fitzgibbon's story. He's a UX leader. He's still working in UX, but he took a little bit of a leap. He didn't take a major, major leap. He's very, very excited about creative writing. He initially started on the side while he was working full time. He started a project and blog about a story of a particular crime in Massachusetts, and he was posting consistently. Through his blog, he received a book offer and book deal to take what he had been sharing on his blog and write a novel about that. He's now a published author. He's been on a book tour where he's sharing information about a murder in Rockport. Why am I sharing this? I want you to know that there are everyday people who are hitting these hard points and they found the other side. The other reason I wanted to share this story is the stories sound very different, but as a product leader and UX researcher, that's my background. In addition to these three people, I've also now talked to more than 100 people about their career pivots. And it turns out there's similar patterns and themes that come up. So Melissa, Stephanie, and Rob may seem to have very different careers and a very different story, but there were similar themes that came up. One theme is there was first a point of mess. So I mentioned that Melissa was laid off. Rob was going through a harder time in the tech world. Stephanie was also dealing with her own challenges, and they hit this moment of mess. The next step I've been hearing from people is that then they take a pause. They just stop and they take a pause to just rest and reflect. None of these people are just jumping into absolutely what's right coming up as new. Another theme that comes up after the pause is that people take time to think about, what are my values? What do I care about? What in my career to date has really offered me the most joy, the most flow? They take that time. All of these people also have mapped out, what is the next action they could take if they were to live their ideal life? And by doing that, they were able to find their next act. I shared these quick stories about Melissa, Stephanie, and Rob. It sounds really clean that they just jumped to the other side and they reached this success. And you may be saying, why hasn't that happened for me? But what I'll tell you is, behind all of those stories was a mess. There were pain points, there were failures along the way. And this getting to the other side didn't happen immediately for any of them. Why it's deeply personal for me is that I mentioned I'm the founder and CEO of Lift Up Connections. 3 years ago, that wasn't who I was. That wasn't my identity. 3 years ago, right around this time, was the start of my messy middle, really the messy start. It was the start of my reckoning. And a little teaser for you, I'm running small communities and cohorts where I share this story. You all are getting the pleasure to hear my very, very quick yarn about my story and what I've learned. So it's my first time really sharing this more publicly with a group. But my story is, and why it's so deeply personal and why I'm sharing this with you, is that 3 years ago, I was rocking it. I'm a single mom by choice. I have a kiddo. 3 years ago, my kiddo was 6. He's now 9. Life was great. I have been in the UX and product world for 20 plus years. I would say that I've had what I viewed as a pretty accomplished career. I started out 25 years ago. I was partnering with Jared Spool for 8 years. I was running his company. And people knew me. I got invited to Singapore, New Zealand. I was traveling around the country talking about UX and product leadership. I also, in addition to viewing myself as a product leader and UX researcher, this was my hat. My zone of genius, and we'll talk about zone of genius and superpowers, is that I'm very, very good at bringing people together and teams together to align on a strategy and vision. So 6, 7 years ago, I was working with the editor-in-chief at Harvard Business Review. He saw my zone of genius here and asked me to come in to work with his leadership team to map out a vision. I've worked with the CEO of GoFundMe. I have been brought in by the former CEO of Adweek. When I say I thought I was rocking it, I meant that on my own, having a child on my own, I was bringing in $500,000 a year. My retainers were 30 to 40K a month. I'm sharing this with you because I thought I had everything together. And then overnight, 3 years ago, like many of us felt, we had different stories. I went from bringing in $500,000 a year to bringing in almost nothing. And as you can probably imagine, my confidence plummeted. I didn't know what to do with this messy middle. This had never happened in 25 years of my career. I was scared. I'm a sole provider for my family, and I didn't know what was next. First, I tried to push through. I tried to find my place again in the product world. Then what happened? This was the denial stage. Then what happened is my confidence plummeted because the identity I had known disappeared and I didn't know how to get it back. So I'm sharing this story because we're now going to start getting into what was next. You can probably imagine I'm not still there at that low, low point, but I was there for a little while. What brought me out of that low, low point? Well, I was feeling unseen, while I was feeling that what I had built for 25 years was gone, while I didn't know what was next and how I would provide for my family, I asked 5 other powerhouse women from tech, who some of them I knew, some of them I didn't know. I asked them to take a leap with me and participate in a pilot I was running. And the pilot was, we were going to get together every week. I didn't tell them exactly what the format would be, but a little teaser. I mentioned my zone of genius. I've worked with product teams to map out a long-term vision for their product lines, the GoFundMes of the world, the Penn Medicines, the Udemys. I've worked with teams to map out a long-term vision for a product. What happens if I take that skill set to work with tech folks to build a long-time vision for their career? I took this little nugget of my brilliance and skill set and brought it to this council. So we went through a 10-week process. I'm going to share some of the techniques with you today, 2 hours every week. And at the end of the 10 weeks, every woman in this group said, "Can we keep meeting?" And this group kept meeting for a year because we went through some of the exercises I'm going to share with you, but we also connected and supported each other and gave us other ideas of where we would go. And if it weren't for these 5 women, you wouldn't be hearing this talk today because it helped me get to the point of refining my vision for my future. Okay, that was a lot. I feel like I shared my life story, the lows and the highs. The good news is I'm at the other side quite a bit. What we're going to talk about, I mentioned that council I was working on. It turns out, as I've talked to hundreds of people who have reinvented themselves, there's a common theme that comes up that as I was working in these councils with people and as they were trying to map out what was next, as they started slowly and incrementally taking action, I'd hear the same thing over and over again that people would say it very much felt like a jumbled puzzle, that there were aspects that were starting to come into place from their background and skill sets and what they love to do and values that if they could just snap those puzzle pieces into place, they'd know what might happen next. And it turns out through my research, both with people I've interviewed as well as research in the space, it turns out there's certain characteristics that if you can focus on these areas, the puzzle pieces start coming together. So the areas are, what are your values? What are your core values? Finding out what about your life, specifically uniquely to you, energizes you. There's this notion of zone of genius. You're your uniquely you, that none of you will come up with exactly the same vision for the future because no one has exactly the experiences and superpowers and brilliance that you do. I mentioned that from the outside external world, I'm seen as a product and UX researcher. Okay, there's a lot of product and UX researchers, but my zone of brilliance is not around that. My zone of genius and brilliance and my superpower is bringing people together to connect, to do amazing things. So when you start thinking about your career, it's about figuring out what about you makes you you and what can you specifically bring to the next act. Career capital is really important. So when Melissa Appel was laid off, when I was just depleted, feeling like I lost my career, there were many directions I could have gone. I could have said, I really like yoga. Maybe I can become a yoga teacher. I didn't do that. And there's a specific reason for that. It turns out when you're going into your next act, if you're reinventing, the way to be successful isn't blowing up everything that you've cultivated in the past. There's a notion of career capital. What have you learned over time? Who have you connected with? What have your successes been along the way? If you can take that, your career capital, what you've accomplished to date, and spin it into something new, only good things will happen. So when I've been going into my next act, I'm not a bar teacher. I'm not a yoga teacher. I don't have connections in that world. It's not where I built my reputation. But what I'm doing now is I'm not teaching on product and UX anymore. But guess who's coming to me? It's people in the tech space because it's the career I've built. I've generated trust, connections, network. What you'll want to think about is what is the career capital you've gained? And finally, there's vision, knowing where you want to get to, and taking some small action steps. So today, we're going to complete 3 exercises. I mentioned today is about you. There are three interactive exercises. With my design and product background, I'm calling this, in essence, a lean sprint. I mentioned these puzzle pieces and what needs to come into place to figure out your next act. There's, in essence, six puzzle pieces that are the main ones. Today, we're going to give you some opportunities to think about three of them. First, we're going to start with what energizes you. Then we'll talk about visioning. And then I mentioned my success criteria is you have something you want to take action on. So putting together small experiments. So here we go. The first exercise that I'd like to have you conduct. I mentioned these puzzle pieces that to decide what's next, you have to know what energizes you and what sparks you. In my intensive career cohort, the women in the cohorts spend a full week thinking about this. You're going to spend 2 minutes and I'll have the time boxed clock going. But here's what I want you to do, either on your computer and a notepad or on a piece of paper that you won't share with anyone else. I want you to reflect on your career so far. We're talking about career capital, but also career energy. And what I want you to think about, some of you have 20, like me, have 25-year careers. Others of you, it may be shorter. But what I want you to think about are three moments in your career when you felt most engaged, most proud of what you were doing, and most in flow. This typically takes people a week, and I'll sort of give you an overview of how this would work if you do this at home. But please spend 2 minutes thinking back on your life and career and jotting down three career moments where you felt this, where you felt most in flow and energized. And then we'll move forward. Okay, so I gave you 2 minutes. I mentioned we usually have a week for this. This is an exercise. I mentioned this as a lean sprint and why I want you to start thinking about this. So when I'm working with people to reinvent their next act over 6 weeks, the first week we spend a lot of time thinking about and prioritizing what your values are in life, why you do what you do. The second exercise we do is what I call a spark map. And this, by far, from attendees who go through my cohort, say it's one of the most helpful exercises to really understand how you've gotten to where you are. I bet most of you have never gone back through your entire career, written down what companies you've worked at, and consciously thought about what about those jobs energized you and what depleted you. And what I ask participants to do for every single job role they've had in their career, they map out 2 to 3 things that energize them and 2 to 3 things that didn't go well, that really depleted them. This is something after this session, I highly encourage you all to do. But what I've also realized is just that exercise that you took 2 minutes to focus on. I'm sure you also thought about what I've seen using this lean exercise. You probably thought about experiences that you haven't really been thinking all that much about recently. And what I'd like to say to you as you look at what you wrote down is to think about when you think about what gives you most joy and where you are in most flow, were there similar activities you were doing? Were there similar types of relationships you had with the people? Were there people who were working with you who lit up when you did this work? The outcome from this type of exercise, doing a spark map or taking the reflection that you did, was that this helps you start getting to where your joy is, where your career capital is, what makes you you, and what's going to light you up in the next act. So what I encourage you to do after today is think about this spark map. Think about a more detailed map where you can start seeing the patterns in the work. So Melissa Pell, for example, I mentioned she's an author now. She was always really, really passionate about working in-house to get teams collaborating together and helping her direct reports really shine, learn how to communicate with executives and C-level. She then went on, she realized one of her superpowers is helping others figure out how to talk to executives. She took that spark and that energy and what she loved, and she wrote a book, and she teaches on that now. But by going through all of her career journey, she could see that over time, it's what the top level leaders appreciated about her in the company, but it was also what some of her direct reports appreciated about her. So, what I encourage you to do is go through the more extensive Spark map. But in the meantime, look at the 3 moments you put down and reflect to yourself, were there any shared themes there? Were there things you were doing that you see some patterns for? And take some time to think about that. Okay, mini exercise 2 in our sprint. I mentioned that one of the best ways that all of the people I've spoken to have gotten to the next act is to take the time to envision what's next. What would your next act look like in 3 to 5 years? I've now pushed that more to 1 to 2 years because things are changing and evolving so quickly in our landscape. So, what I want you to think about now, considering what you put together in your last exercise and thinking about what you see as your zone of genius, what your levels of energy are boosted by, and what your values are, I'd like you to spend 5 minutes, only 5 minutes, to answer these questions. So, it's 2 years in the future. You're living your best life. You're living your most fulfilled life. Everything is lining up that you have a career where you're focusing on your zone of genius. You're aligned with your values. You're doing work that is important to you. You're making an impact. What I'd like you to do is spend 5 minutes telling me that story. A little bit more information you need here. And this is very, very important. I want you to also consider for this vision, what if you didn't care how you were perceived if you had this career and what you'd be doing? What if you had no fears that you wouldn't succeed? What if you knew you'd succeed? What if the money was just flowing in? Money was no object. This is mapping out your wildly audacious career. Please spend 5 minutes on this. Why 5 minutes? I mentioned that I run visioning exercises with product teams. After 5 to 8 minutes of mapping out a future vision, it's diminishing returns. You could spend an hour on this or 5 minutes, and at about the 5 minute mark, you're going to be in a good place. So please spend 5 minutes on that, and then we'll go into what's next for you. Another little hopeful teaser for some of you. The folks who go through my cohort, they've spent weeks leading up to doing this visioning. You've had 10 minutes. Some of you love writing stories. Feel free to write a story for the next 3 minutes. Others of you may be very, very visual. What attendees have found very helpful in the cohort is putting together what I call a visioning collage. Is there any picture or image that represents what your vision would be 2 years from now? It's fine to look for visual imagery as well that reflects what you're thinking. So some of you are storytellers, you can write the narrative. If you're more visual, I'd recommend thinking about what's a visual or a couple of images that reflect where you'd like to be in a couple of years. Final thing I want to talk to you about. When I mentioned to people I'm working on career reinvention or reimagination, one of the pieces of feedback I got was, well, it sounds very privileged to take your career and just map out something entirely new. Career reinvention isn't about mapping out something entirely new. It's, as I said, taking what energizes you, taking your skill set, what was working for you, and then thinking about this is the important thing. What is the one first step you could take to get there? Another little hidden secret here, I was a bit vulnerable sharing that period where my confidence plummeted. I didn't know what was coming next. I had been highly successful, and then everything in me made me feel like I wasn't anymore and I was unseen. And I shared that pilot with you. When I had that pilot, it happened a year and a half ago. And it took me 6 months from the beginning of that pilot, even though these women were saying they'd like to meet every week forever and that they got so much value. And I saw their new stories here and what was coming to fruition. It took me 6 months from the time I started this cohort to actually sharing at all with anyone what I was doing. I had a vision, but I had a lot of obstacles in place in my mind. I thought there were negatives. I thought there were too many risks. I was scared. In all of the stories with the 100+ people I've spoken to and what I've seen in my career, the way to move forward is not to take this full vision and try to put it into reality overnight. The way to move forward is picking the one smallest thing you could do to move forward in that direction. So, what I wanted to share with you now, it's final exercise of the day. Given your vision, you're going to be wearing a new hat. So, I mentioned my identity had been UX leader, product leader. My new identity about a year and a half to a year ago was a collective force who puts together collective powerhouse women to reimagine their next act. But there's another piece to it. I was the collective force that brings powerhouse women and allies together to build new and creative work outside of our traditional system. Sounds really fancy, but I spent a lot of time thinking about that. I didn't build all of these ideas overnight. I did one action first. This is an exercise calling wearing your new hat for 30 minutes. So rather than getting overwhelmed by everything you would have to do to create this new future, what is the one thing you would do or the 1 to 2 things you'd do to get to your next act? Write those down. And then what I ask you to do is sometime, hopefully today, but in the next week, put a clock on, give yourself 30 minutes, think about who this new person is and how they would act and behave, and spend 30 minutes wearing this new hat and identity. In my case, how I move forward, after 6 months of not doing anything beyond my pilot council, I wrote a post on LinkedIn talking about my lessons learned for women as they're reinventing their career. And what came from that is a conversation from people in my network who were also thinking about career reinvention. It led to networking, it led to more connections, it led to me getting more informed in terms of what I do next. I did not know Melissa Tell very well up until making this pivot for me, or Rob Fitzgibbon. I was putting myself out there in a little pilot, and that way I connected with people to learn more. So pick that one thing that you will take action on in the next, hopefully this afternoon, while it's still fresh in your mind. A bunch of people have gone through my cohorts now, and I mentioned I've based my puzzle framework based on what I've learned from my interviews. But this is the thing that the cohort folks told me the most, is that all of these techniques I gave you will help you move forward. But the number one thing you could do is get together with like-minded people in your network or a group of people who are in this same position and go through the process with them. I mentioned this pilot led me to my next act. And the reason for this is the power of the visioning I shared with you is not just you writing out the vision. It's you sharing your vision with someone else and getting feedback on it. You sharing with people and having accountability partners to move forward. When I was having a hard time moving forward, these ladies got me started. So I was not only the pilot moderator and facilitator, I was a participant in the first one. So as you're going through the reinvention, are there other people in your network that you could go through this with? There's a couple of ways to reimagine. I mentioned there's the cohort-like experience, which I run with folks. I've been primarily working only with women in tech for these cohorts right now, not because women in tech are the only ones trying to reimagine, but I've been focusing on bringing people who are in the same position and have somewhat shared life experiences. So I do have an upcoming cohort for that. I also work one-on-one with folks to go through the process. But I'd also say I highly encourage you, if you're finding these frameworks helpful, finding your group of people and going through the process together. That's key. What I was hoping to show you through these exercises is giving you a little lens to start thinking about what your differentiators are and how you can move forward.